All right, everyone, we are going to get started. That seems like it's kind of picking up my voice, sort of. Cool. Well, I'm also naturally loud and obnoxious, so you're going to hear me regardless. Well, we're going to get started with the first talk of track 2, given by Sean Juroviesky. And I'm going to read his bio verbatim here because I don't have this memorized. Sean is a dedicated security and risk management expert with extensive experience navigating complex environments. Sean excels at developing a comprehensive understanding of intricate systems and crafting strategic roadmaps to revitalize security programs. By identifying high-risk areas and optimizing the use of existing resources, Sean removes barriers between teams to enhance communication and coordination, driving effective security outcomes. Beyond their professional pursuits, Sean finds joy in backpacking through the mountains with their adventurous Australian Shepherd and twins, embracing the serenity of nature and the thrill of exploration. And I pass it over to Sean.
Man, that sounds like it was written by AI. My name is Sean, and this talk is the risky business of risk illiteracy. Some people call me adware because I'll be speaking about the evils of marketing and adware in general over at CypherCon in Milwaukee. So if you'll come out there, please come see my talk about all that is evil with marketing. I'm currently a senior security engineer with SoundCloud, and I've past experience in healthcare, marketing, nonprofit, and the entertainment sectors. I'm also one of the organizers of a community called BSidesROC. We are one of the largest cybersecurity networking communities, probably in the US, but absolutely within Chicago. We're a little over 1,000 people, and we meet every single Thursday of the month in one of the Chicago suburbs. We also have chapters now in Las Vegas and Galway, Ireland. And as I was introduced, I also do love to go camping. I've done lots of camping over in the Appalachians here, the Catskills when I was growing up, and in the Green Mountains as well. So this talk is all about what I think is wrong with risk measurement. Now, to get to what I think is wrong with it, we have to first figure out what is the point of security. Why do we do what we do? Well, at the end of the day, because it's pretty hard to completely eliminate risk, we focus on reducing it to what we consider an acceptable level. But what is an acceptable level? It's a little bit hard to judge, but from a business perspective, from the people that are paying us money to do our jobs, typically they think of it as risk. They don't like losing money because of ransomware attacks and other things like that. So, when I talk about risks, what tends to jump to mind? Usually it's things like headlines, it's memes you're seeing on social media, or a really super cool 0-day that was just dropped. Things like DeepSeek, things like SIM swapping. There were some headlines about Signal that were very overblown. And then FIDO2 defeats. But that FIDO2 defeat is exceptionally hard to reproduce. You need several $100,000 in laboratory equipment, and you need to steal someone's FIDO2 key and spend 8 hours tinkering with it. And you have to have the knowledge to do all that and not mess it up. You also have to irreparably destroy their FIDO2 key, so you can't give it back to them, so they're eventually going to figure out, hey, something's wrong. So unless you're a state actor or something like that, that's probably not going to happen. So, a few years ago, Grammarly was in the news, maybe like a year after it came out, and executives were like, this sounds like it might steal my IP. This sounds pretty bad. So, an executive of mine comes up to me and says, hey, you need to take care of this right now. You need to drop everything, and you need to get rid of Grammarly throughout the organization, because I'm sure someone's probably using it. Well, we were in the middle of an incident. We were actively losing money. We had an active outage we were mitigating, but he said, no, you need to drop that and you need to fix this. And I said, well, I guess I'd like to keep my job. So I did that. But I don't think that was appropriate risk prioritization. So it's really important to think about where most incidents actually begin. 68% of incidents involve a non-malicious human factor. And you might ask yourself, what is that? For the most part, it's things like social engineering. It could be things like storing passwords in Google Drive and then saving that Google Drive document as public on the web, as, one does. It can be all sorts of things like that. But studies show that of those 68% of incidents, 98% could have been stopped just by enforcing multi-factor from the application that was compromised. And multi-factor is very often a factor of things you've probably heard of, like the Midnight Blizzard compromise of Microsoft. That was incredible how in-depth they were able to compromise Microsoft and how long they went without Microsoft realizing it. All of that was, there were a number of really horrible things Microsoft did that enabled them to do that, but at the end of the day, MFA would have stopped that. It would have stopped that chain of events from occurring. There was also the MGM gaming hack a few years ago where all their casinos, all their hotels were basically offline, taking reservations with pen and paper. That was because someone called up their help desk and social engineered the MFA reset for a systems administrator. Ticketmaster. I'm sure everyone in this room's probably received an email saying, yeah, your everything was compromised. You might want to look into that from Ticketmaster. All of that was because their parent account in Snowflake that they used extremely heavily for their databasing had no multi-factor. So, why do I keep talking about MFA? Is it because this talk is about it? No. It's because it is really simple to implement, but time and time again, it is a really massive factor in instance. So I have a few ideas about why I think that is. One, it's boring. It doesn't grab headlines. It's not attention-getting. In order to figure out that MFA was the cause of many of those incidents, you would have had to go search all the way to the bottom of the news articles where there was maybe a blurb about it. And then the other factor is it's inconvenient. It's something that I'm sure all of us get frustrated with occasionally, and we're advocates of it. It's annoying to go find which of your 30 TOTP apps that you have to put in. It's inconvenient. And I'm sure all of us have experience with it. Our banks mandate we do it. Our schools mandate we do it. Our workplaces mandate we do it. Microsoft is maybe mandating that you do it according to them. So, what is this talk actually about? This talk isn't about risk modeling per se, though there's a little blurb about that, but that would be really, really hard to teach you in an hour. This talk is focusing on ensuring you're viewing the forest through the trees, ensuring you're not getting lost in the weeds, and ensuring you're tackling your risks appropriately. So, to get back to risk, it's really important to figure out what risks you're facing. And in order to figure that out, you need a few things. You need threat models, you need risk maps, you need a list of how you are mitigating all of your risks. And you also need to understand what the potential impact is of those risks. If this event occurs, what will happen to the organization? There are a few ingredients that you can use to build your threat models. So, first, you need a complete inventory of what you have, because you can't secure it if you don't know what you have. It's fairly simple. Or at least you'd think it would be fairly simple. Then you need some data flow diagrams, because you need to understand how information is being passed from one level to the next throughout the whole topology. And then it's really important to understand what risks your business specifically is facing. Every industry, every company has unique threats and unique opportunities that might occur. And before you can actually build your threat model, you need to know and have a really firm understanding of what it is that you're securing, because there is probably a lot more of it than you actually realize. People went out, they used a company card, they bought a SaaS app and never told you. They connected that SaaS app to CRM for marketing purposes, and they never told you. They went out and signed up for this free service and that free service, and they Google OAuth to it and shared data with that service, and now you don't even know that they have access to view everyone at your company's calendar. So you have to build that understanding of what it is you have. You have to lay all of that out onto a topology. How does it connect? Where can data flow across it? And why can it connect? It's really important to understand the why, because if it can connect, but there's no reason for it to, it really shouldn't be able to. So this is a chart that I absolutely stole, but I really liked it because whoever drew this is a lot more talented in draw.io than myself. I love how it talks about all the different entry points and exit points, because Google Ads over there in the top left is one entry and exit point. Then at the other end, there's Shopify, there's external APIs you're connected to. It goes in depth about all of the different entry points, which there tend to be a lot more than you actually realize. So you need to build a lot of data flow diagrams because topologies are really complex and your eyes are just going to glaze over if you actually put everything onto one topology. So you need to build out an understanding of, at the highest level, this is what's occurring for the most part. And then you need to build little samples of, if we dive into this service is actually 30 different microservices. They connect to these 12 APIs. They share these datas and this across all these different ways, and they do them with this. And then you have to also label all of your different trust boundaries, what can access where, what can access both, where does data flow stop, where does it continue. And as you go throughout this, you're going to be thinking to yourself, is this a threat? I feel like this is a little bit risky. And you're probably building this with people from different teams. So you're going to say, hey, can they actually exploit this in this way? And they're going to say, no, the permissions for that account are limited to just read or whatever. That's threat modeling. You just thought of a threat, you just found out you mitigated it, and there's no vulnerability. You should write that down probably, because in 6 months, you're probably going to have that same question again. In a year, you're going to forget it. Or you might just be praised as an absolute hero by whoever replaces you, because you actually documented it. So this is a really basic data flow diagram, which includes trust boundaries. It's really important to label all of these, to take notes on each trust boundary and what does this trust boundary mean, which accounts can pass through it, which accounts can pass through multiple trust boundaries, all of that good things. But it's also important to understand that trust boundaries aren't firm. It is really fairly easy to defeat an LLM, and typically it goes right through that trust boundary where that prompt and response is then fooled into being interpreted by a series of commands by that LLM. That happens all the time. It is fairly easy to replicate, and there does not honestly seem to be a decent solution in eliminating it at this moment. So, like I was saying before, you're probably working with other teams as you build this topology. And it's really important to involve them because they understand their own tech stacks a lot better than you probably actually want to understand them. Because if you know all of this, then maybe you should be getting their salary as well. So they're going to help you build it. They're going to help you diagram it. And as you make assumptions that are incorrect, they're going to help you correct it. And they're going to help strengthen what it is that you're actually writing. And throughout your threat modeling process, you're going to continuously involve them because they know how they've mitigated these things. Or they realize that, oh, that's a good point. We didn't mitigate that. So it's really important to just continuously involve them and continuously build relationships with them. Because if you build stronger relationships with them, maybe before they build something, they'll ask you to threat model it first. Because it's much easier to mitigate threats before you build it. And maybe you might even have some fun along the way, and we'll talk about it later in this presentation. So, as I said before, as I'm going to say time and time again, you really want to document everything that you're figuring out, everything that you're finding, and you want to be able to understand it.
That's not documentation, that's just the source code.
I just like the picture.
Always a great thing, but, you know.
But you also need to understand what it is that you're documenting. Because if it is source code and you're not having a firm understanding of what's in the source code, what is the source code doing, when you leave and come back to this project in 6 months, next quarter, whatever, you're probably going to forget some minute details. So you need to understand everything that you're writing. And you will thank yourself so many times later on. So, in order to threat model, you need to know what a threat is. Threats are events. They are occurrences. A lot of times people mix them up with vulnerabilities, but the threat is the actual what can happen. What can an attacker do? What can happen here? Or what can a staff member do unintentionally? Because unintentional events are threats. They are things we need to mitigate. Backing up your database in order to ensure that some dev can't just delete your production database that you've never backed up, that is a threat. So that's something that you have to threat model. It's something you have to mitigate. And you don't just want to scrape the surface, because if you've acquired a company and they've offboarded most of the services that they're doing, but they still have this one thing, that one thing they'll offboard in 3 weeks. 3 weeks can take years. It can take a really, really long time. And they'll keep telling you, no, 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 you don't have to work through this. You don't have to mitigate those vulnerabilities. We're going to be off that lightning quick. But how often does that actually happen? Or you've come into a new company, or you've been at a company for years, and you figure out, we acquired this company 15 years ago, and they're actually doing this one service still on their old infrastructure that they forgot about, that's automatically paid for out of a different account. It's an FTP. Yes, there's no S. It's an FTP, and it's also hosting some people's shareware for some reason. And you find this, and you say, what in the world? So, throughout this process, we've been threat modeling. As you build a topology, you naturally tend to start threat modeling. We, as security professionals, tend to start saying, this looks like a bad idea. Should we be doing this? And so, at the end of the day, threat modeling is, what did you build, or what will you build? What can go wrong with it? And then how have you prevented it from going wrong, or how will you prevent it from going wrong once it does go wrong? And then at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, did I do a good job of that? I feel like a lot of us in security never feel like we can actually say yes to that question. So while it's important to go through it a few times, while it's important to reconsider it, to ask others, to bounce their opinions off of it, to say, hey, do you feel like I'm missing anything in this threat model? It's always great to get outside feedback, to get another set of eyes on it. But also, it's really important to understand sometimes you just need to step away for a week, for a day, and come at it with fresh eyes, and maybe you'll find something new. So if you end up building this topology, if you end up doing all this, then you end up with a threat model. So what do you do with that threat model once you have it? And is that threat model a list of risks? So if I ask you, what do you think a risk is? What tends to jump to mind? Do you think about 0 days you've yet to mitigate? Do you think of operating systems which are still out of date, which you really, really should update? But are those actually risks? Sometimes you might have a CVSS 9.9, but it's not actually a risk to your organization, because a risk only exists if there's both a threat and vulnerability. So if SSH has some kind of vulnerability on the system you're using, but you've disabled it across your organization, you've disabled it and turned it off and all those good things, then there's no risk. You've mitigated that by disabling it. In order for that risk to be exploited, that system would already have to be compromised. So you've mitigated it, and congratulations, you've just closed out a risk. As you find your risks, as you uncover them, it's really important to consider the actual impact of the risks and how risky the risks are. It's fairly difficult to gauge how risky risks are. That's sort of the point of this talk. So I like to break it down into 3 factors. What is the impact to the business if this risk is exploited? How likely is it How feasible is it that this risk will actually come into play? And how well can we mitigate this risk? Understanding impact is really difficult, and it actually really requires that you understand how your business generates revenue. It requires that you understand how staff go about their day. Because if these systems go down, what happens? How many services go down? Are you still able to sell things to people? Are you still able to fulfill orders, but you can't upgrade your subscription to a higher level? What sort of impact does this have on the actual revenue generation for your business? And when an attacker does this, when an attacker compromises these systems, takes them down, whatever it is they do, what can they do with the access that they achieve? Are they able to spend client money because they stole credit cards, or because you you purchase ads for your clients and have access to their money? Are they able to take down client content? Can they take down content that they don't like? Can they upload content that you don't like? Can they download protected data that you are legally obligated to protect? And then, can access to that one system that's been compromised break access somewhere else? If they get someone's credentials for Terraform, are they able to remove and alter the permissions that databases have, and then suddenly they just lock you out of all of your databases? And then you also have to understand how much money will your business lose if this happens. If you say that, oh, all the music streaming, for instance, still works, but people aren't able to purchase an upgrade to their current plan, well, how long will that take to mitigate? And then what is the likelihood of, not the likelihood, how long will it take for you to actually resolve this issue? So you do some math on that, saying, we lost 10 customers during this 1 minute period that we had this outage. Okay, so that's 10 customers times $10 a month. That's $100. And then that's $100 times 12 months, because on average, most people are fairly unlikely to make a purchase again within the next 12 months if they weren't able to make the purchase right then. And then I'm talking a lot about money, especially in this section. It may not be our biggest interest in protecting companies. It may not be what motivates us the most. We want to find the cool vulnerabilities. We want to be those hacker catchers. We want to do whatever it is that we want to do. But it's why companies pay us money. It's why they hire us. Even if you're working for a nonprofit, if that nonprofit loses too much money, then that nonprofit probably won't survive. So unfortunately, it's really impactful across all of what we do. And at the end of the day, if you're able to talk in these terms to executives who don't care about security, but they do care about money, it's a lot easier to justify headcount. It's a lot easier to justify purchasing additional tools if you can talk about the potential losses that they will face if they don't do this. Next up, there's calculating likelihood. Calculating likelihood is exceedingly difficult. It is something that you learn in statistics courses. It is not something that I can teach you in the 3 minutes I've allocated to this section. What I can tell you is that there are things like Monte Carlo simulations you can use to get rough estimates. There are statistics courses, probably at this university, that you can take. You can read a book called How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity. It's a very good book. It gives you probably like a 101 understanding of it, some rough math, some formulations you can do to actually say to your executives, these are the likelihoods these events will occur. So if you end up but it's also something that you can just gauge from data that you already have. If your logs show attackers exploit a 0-day, an average of 14 days after that 0 day is released, then you know you really, really should mitigate that vulnerability within 14 days, though that is absolutely exceedingly unlikely. 90% of the time, 0 days don't get exploited for years. Most organizations don't see them actually being tried against their org for years, unless it's something like all those Fortinet vulnerabilities that were released time and time and time and time again for the past, is it 3 years now? Come on, guys. Hope no one works for Fortinet here. Yeah, unless it's something like that. And you might ask yourself, what's the difference between there? Well, it's really exceedingly easy to utilize those Fortinet exploits. And because it's so easy to use, it's low-hanging fruit. It's something that attackers are going to try first. So it's really important to understand when you're calculating likelihood, probably the largest factor at play is how achievable is it for the attackers? How exploitable is it for the attackers? How will they be able to do this? How easy will it be for them? And at the end of the day, after you figured all of this out, you have to actually mitigate what you found. And as you add MFA, as you do all these mitigations, as you run all these updates, it's really also important, again, to document it. You need to remember why you mitigated it the way you did, how you mitigated it, and all these important things that you are likely to forget once the next thing catches fire. And you might ask yourself, well, did I mitigate it well enough? I decided that because executives said we couldn't turn off this one feature because it's critical, and because the vendor is yet to release a patch, we've put it behind a WAF, and that mitigates most of the risk for us. And so as you document it, it's really important to understand who, what, why, and when. Who owns the vulnerability? Who will actually be the person that mitigates it once you can mitigate it? Or who you have to talk to time and time again to get them to mitigate it. What is the mitigation? How are you mitigating it? You have to understand why are you mitigating it the way you are. Are you eliminating it? If you're not, then you need to understand what are the potential impacts that remain and why you're doing it the way you are. Did an executive tell you, no, we can't do anything to this because we're turning that off in 2 weeks, so we just have to accept it? And then you also have to ask yourself, when are we going to talk about this mitigation and this vulnerability and this risk again? It is exceedingly important that you don't just say, okay, we'll close that out, we'll talk about that next year, or if it has another vulnerability. You need to plan to actually have a firm date, a meeting on the calendar with all the stakeholders and say, okay, we are going to talk about this again in 2 months. You said you're going to turn off this feature in 2 weeks. Okay, I'm going to talk to you in 15 days about why that feature is still on and about how we're going to actually mitigate it. Then there's risk acceptance. If someone tells you that you cannot fully mitigate something because they don't feel like it, you have to understand that only the actual risk owners can accept risk. We as security individuals cannot accept risk. Directors cannot accept risk. Most VPs cannot accept risk. Typically, it's going to be someone like a CISO, a CTO, a CEO, someone who actually has a stake in the business, someone that the owner or board or whatever of the business can actually put blame on. They're the only people that can accept risk because they're the ones that actually have a stake in this business. And if your CTO says, I don't know about this, I think we should do it the way we should do it this way, but we shouldn't do it that way, but he refuses to sign a document saying, I, as the CTO, accept this risk, then you have to go to his boss and you have to say, you have to accept it, because I'm not going to sign this piece of paper. Someone with a stake in the business needs to sign. When you present these risks for them to accept, you have to create an exhaustive, you have to ensure that you're covering your rear. You have to present an exhaustive threat model of what is the potential impact of this risk, what can actually go wrong with it. And you have to list out all of the alternative solutions that you think is better and why you think they are better. And again, this is to cover your rear and ensure that they are saying, okay, maybe at the end of the day we can compromise and go to this slightly better mitigation, or they'll just flat out tell you no, and you've covered your rear. And they can still fire you if they feel like it, and they can still blame you, but at least they'll feel a little bit embarrassed about that because you got them on paper to say, I told you so. So, what is mitigation? Mitigation is reducing the likelihood or the impact of a potential risk, because oftentimes it is really hard to eliminate the absolute possibility that something will happen, right? We can James Bond it as much as we want. We can have insider threats who've been at the business for 10 years and, oh, they can still exploit this because they can revert it. They can exploit it some other way. Okay, yeah, that's still a likelihood, I guess, but we can reduce that. So, risks are eliminated by removing either a vulnerability or a threat. If neither of those are possible, then it's not a risk. And that's oftentimes not possible. So, what we can do is we can add some protections. We can make it less likely or less impactful. Less likely, we can send phishing videos, catchy, fun clips to staff, and maybe they'll remember this and, this looks like that video I just watched. Should I still click this link? Should I put my credentials into this text box that has no CSS, that just looks horrible? I think I will. At least they considered it, right? You can send OWASP training games to make mandatory training for your developers slightly less miserable. There's all sorts of things that you can do that might actually have an impact on likelihood. Or you can do technical things to reduce likelihood, like put it behind a WAF, do some other configuration, and then that might require it be a multi-step process. So this can't be exploited unless this gets exploited. Okay, that's adding a barrier, that's making it both less likely and possibly less of an impact. But if you're just putting a barrier in front of it, it's probably not reducing the impact unless you're also putting walls around it. So you can do things like microsegmentation. So if one service gets compromised, then it can't pivot, it can't move, it can't impact your business further. And as you go through this, as you add all these different mitigations, reducing impact and likelihood, you then want to recalculate, how much did we reduce the impact? Did this go from a $10 million compromise to a $500,000 compromise? Cool, that is great to put on my CV. That is great to put when I request a promotion. And also, at the end of the day, unfortunately, it's likely to have a lot larger of an impact than some super cool tech thing that you put on your request to be promoted. Right, so I apologize for the horribly tiny text, but this is how I like to lay out my risk tracking. Risk, what do I title it? Description, what is the actual risk that we found? What is the potential impact of the risk we found? Who is the team that is going to be repairing it? Who is the actual owner of the risk? The stakeholder who has the ability to sign off on this risk if we mitigate it the way we did. And then how are we planning to mitigate it, or how have we mitigated it? Next up, there is the date that you are next going to review this risk. Probably the most important section of your risk tracker. When will we talk about this again? When can I harass you to ensure that, hey, no, you accepted it for 3 weeks, those 3 weeks are up, we need to talk about this again. And then, has it been accepted? And what is the vague risk level? Then, extremely importantly, did they sign and accept that risk? You want to link a PDF or DocuSign link or whatever right into there to demonstrate, okay, this is my CYA right there. So it's really important to get people to accept that they are responsible for risks. It is really hard to get people to accept that sometimes because one team that built this feature was split into 2 teams. Most of those people aren't there anymore. How do you decide which of those 2 teams will actually take ownership of this and actually be the team that mitigates it? And it's really often difficult. Sometimes you even have to go to the CEO and say, pick one of these 2 people. It is now theirs, because I'm not going to spend all of my time and all my engineers' time engineering our product to fix vulnerabilities. That's not our job. Our job is to find them and help you do that. But I don't have 30 developers. I can't fix this feature. I can't do this. That's just not practical. And then always, 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 Excel sheets keep going to the right like forever. So link all of your documents, link all of your threat models for each of your risks. link all the relevant tickets that you've received, news articles if you want, links to CVSS databases, all that good stuff. Just ensure you have one central place that you can find your documentation, because it's really hard to find a Jira ticket sometimes. So you want a central place where you can go and say, okay, cool, that is where that link is. Because Jira search is broken. So, as you continue to track your risks, as I've said tons of times throughout this talk, open risks should always have a follow-up date. And before you actually close out and say that a risk has been mitigated, it's been eliminated, you should ensure that it actually has, because sometimes vendors will release a patch for something and it won't work, or it'll be really easy to fuzz and then still exploit it. So it's really important to ensure that you actually have mitigated this risk. You haven't just done what the vendor says is appropriate. Then, as I said before, I put a risk level on there. Risk levels are really hard to judge, especially I don't like to have all of the different levels on my risk tracker, because that just makes your eyes scroll past it and it removes more important information that you could be looking at. So I like to kind of just vaguely combine likelihood and impact that I've represented more conclusively elsewhere as just like a vague, how important is this to me? And then there's even more about tracking. Please don't ever delete anything you put on your risk tracker. There's a ton of reasons why. This is both to cover your rear, because if you said you eliminated it, then in your risk tracker you've documented how you've done that. So you can say, okay, no, we did put an effort, it's just that the vendor lied to us. Or, no, it's a new vulnerability that was released. I know it's similar, but no, we did actually complete this. Plus, it helps set precedents. If some executive wants to accept a risk and just ignore a problem, you can say, but like 6 months ago, we had a really similar vulnerability, and you refused to do it, and we got that fixed in 3 weeks. They might feel a little bit embarrassed about that and might say, you know what, you're right. We were planning on dumping that feature in 6 months, but it's fairly likely that project will run long, so I guess we can prioritize this right now. Plus, it might be potentially mandated because of GRC, because of different requirements. If something's been eliminated, it still should be tracked. And then it's really good for your annual review, for your resume. You should probably put these somewhere else that you can access, if not confidential information, of course, but somewhere that if you get fired, you want to put on your resume and say, these are the impacts I had there. You should probably track that somewhere personally. But if you forget to do so, or if you forgot that document exists for 6 months and you've added a couple things here, it is a great place to go back and refresh yourself on, maybe I can make my resume a little bit better with these points. So earlier in the talk, I said you might have some fun with these different teams that you're working across. Because service owners know their stacks way better than you yourself know, it is really important to build relationships with them, and maybe you can sit down with them and do a little bit of Dungeons and Dragons, or hacking and dragons, or whatever you want to call it. So it's important to encourage them to get hackery. They can sit down, they can risk model your own topology, and you can just roll dice to make it random. Your mitigation didn't work. Okay, how are you responding to this now? And this helps you threat model and build real threats for your business. But it could also just teach them really important skills so they don't have to constantly ask you all these different questions. Or before they even come to you, if someone comes to them with an idea or they come up with a brilliant solution, they might say, no, wait, actually, that didn't work in Dungeons and Dragons. You can make up completely fake scenarios with random topology just to teach them good skills, just to get them better into the practice of it. And you can even have some fun. They can pwn different teams. If you've got a positive vibe, maybe you can even put people against each other, but always keep things really positive. You don't want to start a fight because some guy found some really bad mitigate vulnerability that another team didn't mitigate. It's important to do these semi-regularly because it both helps you find mitigations and vulnerabilities that you have, but it also helps strengthen the skills. And you can even mix things up. You can make front-end devs SOC analysts. You can make back-end devs front-end devs. You can take a lawyer and throw them in somewhere. You can make someone be a lawyer and see how they can craft a really good PR release. But at the end of the day, there's going to be more risks. There's going to be more vulnerabilities. Our job keeps going and going and going. So it is extremely important. Probably the most important point in here is to stay focused on what you have. If a new 0-day comes out, fine, figure out relevancy, impact, likelihood, those good things. But don't just fix it right then. Prioritize it properly, because if you don't actually close out the risks that you have, if you just keep focusing on the newest, latest, greatest vulnerability, you're going to spend all of your time building the best safe without actually closing the door. Here are some really great resources from OWASP. They have tons and tons of information. There's fantastic information all over about actually threat modeling in more specific detail than I was able to get into here. But I would like to thank you all for your time. Thank you all for coming to my talk, and ask if you have any questions. Yep.
You talked about reducing potential cost of a risk from 20 million to 5, obviously as an example. But most of the time, don't we end up evaluating risks more qualitatively than quantitatively? So how do you make that leap from qualitative to quantitative?
That is extremely difficult. That is, making that leap is the topic of not a talk, but like a 3-day course. I can say for the most part, you can figure out what the impact is to your business. If a risk happens, how much money will your business lose during an outage? That's now quantitative. That lost money is the potential impact. And if you can reduce it from all of our music going down, so pissed customers will just start unsubscribing the second we're up again, to people can't upgrade their subscription, that is a massive reduction. Instead of losing tons and tons of customers, you're just not gaining new customers.
Two-part question. So on the spreadsheet that you were showing that for the really small text that you were tracking, for the person who owns it, if that risk is going to be accepted by the business, do you put that first, like the CEO's name or whomever there? Do you like replace the technical person who would understand the mitigation with the person who's actually just saying, yeah, we're not going to do this? Is that what you would do? And
Yep.
then part two is, why do you feel that a VP or a senior VP would have enough stake in the game to be able to accept that risk? And just,
Yeah, so it definitely, so that's why I had both a team section and an owner section, because the owner is going to be the executive, because that might be a chief marketing officer, maybe they can accept the risk. Oftentimes, executive vice presidents can accept risk, but it really depends on the company, it depends on the size of it, and it depends on what a VP can do. If a VP doesn't have like an actual financial stake in the business, are they able to say we should ignore this? How comfortable do they feel with that? And how comfortable do you feel with that? Because if this VP answers to an EVP who answers to some other VP, that doesn't seem like someone that's going to actually be able to accept the risk. You probably have to go to a higher tier to have them accept that.
yeah, and just to follow up, so I think like some of the difficulties that I've seen is you've got VPs who they've been tasked with growing the business and making more money, and so they're just saying, to hell with everything, we have to take these risks. We can't afford to not do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, thanks.
Yeah, that's why, I mean, it depends how comfortable you feel in the company. You can tell someone's boss, hey, you have 5 minutes. I feel like he's accepting this, but he's not fully considering something. Do it in a polite manner to try to not get fired. But it depends how comfortable you feel with doing that. It depends on your dynamics. It depends how often do you socialize with the people that person answers to.
Not at all. Okay.
To add very far-reaching consequences. So, oh, this is an end-of-life OS. Well, that end-of-life OS is going to lock you to a certain forest level, which over time is going to lock you to certain types of encryption that you can use. They're going to have far-reaching consequences to the whole organization, not just that specific area that risk is in. So now that's risk for the entire organization, and that's when you need to go up to that high level, because only they can accept that, because I'm only responsible for this small little slice, but this impacts the entire company. So that's a really bad day.
Yep, you on my right?
Curious what you would think the appropriate, like, obviously an Excel sheet is endless in either direction. At what point do you think that a company needs to consider investing in like GRC software rather than using just an Excel spreadsheet for tracking everything?
At the point that you can get the money to purchase it?
When you're evaluating risk and sort of prioritizing different threats and vulnerabilities, do you ever incorporate like uncertainty into your estimations? Like if there's a certain threat, but it's uncertain, like there's certain aspects of it that are uncertain what the impact might be or how likely it is to actually become a threat that you need to worry about. Is that something you can incorporate into your estimates?
It's not really possible to calculate uncertainty, or at least maybe it is, and I don't have enough of a background in statistics, but what I can say is I tend to, if I can't calculate it for my own company, I tend to look at the industry as a whole. What are people in the healthcare industry doing about this risk? How often are those companies being exploited? If there's 100 companies in the healthcare industry, every 5 years, one of them gets popped. Maybe I can use, from a similar risk, maybe I can use that to kind of guesstimate our own uncertainties.
I've understood the emphasis you put on documentation, but by any chance, this is just me being lazy. Do you have any templates or any reference documents apart from the West things that we can use as a reference and get started?
I do not. I think all of mine are proprietary company-owned ones, but I do think there are some really, really fantastic ones available online for that. There is a book that I think is called Threat Modeling, Designing for Security. That book is fantastic, and it also includes a bunch of online resources that you could reference.
My apologies, we're kind of out of time here. Just got some over. Sorry.
No problem. Thank you all for your time.